Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I truly hope you're safe, happy, and healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of virtual conversations about issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Of all of our Carnegie Connect sessions, perhaps with the exception of COVID, I suspect none are more consequential than the future of American politics and security than today's discussion on the roots and rise of right-wing extremism in America, encompassing also the ideologies of white supremacy and white nationalism. There is, to be sure, domestic extremism on the left, but as the events of January 6th clearly demonstrate, the magnitude of the problem is to be found on the right side of the extremist spectrum. A recent CSIS study reported that 2/3 of the attacks in 2020 were undertaken by white supremacists and like-minded extremists. Last August, a self-professed Antifa supporter killed a Trump supporter in Portland, Oregon. According to the FBI, that was the first killing in 20 years by what the Bureau classifies as a, quote, anarchist violent extremist. Indeed, it may well be that the Trump administration's focus on the Antifa threat during the critical summer of 2020 diverted precious law enforcement resources from the more ominous threat that was building from the right. In any event, this is a serious problem. Last month, the White House ordered a review of that threat of domestic violent extremism by the Director of National Intelligence. So you now have a Department of Homeland Security, a new Attorney General who oversaw the investigation of the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, Merrick Garland, and Justice Department now focused on handling probably, and Mary, you'll have to tell us if this is accurate, one of the largest investigations in its history. As of last week, I think 300 had either been arrested or charged, with the feds investigating as many as 500 cases. So clearly, I think it's time for a new definition of homeland security. We spent billions, if not trillions, on Afghanistan and Iraq to secure the homeland from the transnational jihadi threat. But when the threat actually came, well, by and large, it came from a virus that has now claimed more American lives than World War I, II, and Vietnam combined. But now we're faced with the threat of violent domestic extremism. Analyzing the roots and rise of these groups, I think, is like peeling back an onion, particularly for someone as uninitiated as I am in this subject. There are really so many layers and so many questions. Of the several dozen people charged with conspiracy crimes for January 6th, as of mid-February, 18 were known to have ties to two groups, Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers. Who are these groups? What do they stand for? The Canadian government recently designated Proud Boys as a terrorist group, and federal prosecutors have said that the Oath Keepers put into motion much of the violence that overwhelmed the Capitol. And these groups aren't even part of the harder right, the white supremacist and nationalist groups, such as Hammerskin Nation, League of the South, or the Base. A significant percentage of those charged had military backgrounds, and more than a few, to be sure, were former members of law enforcement or off-duty police. How deep do those ties run? And what about the so-called political support for these groups? People like Roger Stone, Alex Jones, Ali Alexander of Stop the Steal, they've amplified the threat, including, of course, the chief influencer of all, the former president. Does law enforcement have a multi-layered strategy to deal with this multi-layered problem? Is there a serious strategy that's possible? And finally, what of social media, its role in messaging and communications? What, if anything, can be done to limit or end big tech's platforms for some of these right-wing ideologies? A lot of questions. Unfortunately, as usual, I don't have to answer any of them. But we have three extraordinary panelists who can. Marc Ginsberg is the president of a great organization, Coalition for a Safer Web. Marc was also the former U.S. ambassador to Morocco and a White House Middle East advisor. Rachel Kleinfeld is known to all of you. She's a senior fellow at Carnegie's Democracy, Conflict and Governance program, a great colleague of mine, where she focuses on issues of rule of law, security, and governance in conflict countries, fragile states, and states in transition. Finally, I'm pleased to welcome Mary McCord, who's the Executive Director and Legal Director at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Freedom, ICAP, and a visiting professor of law at Georgetown. She previously served as the Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the U.S. Department of Justice and Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the National Security Division. You know the format, 5 minutes for presentations from each of you, an annoying round of questions from me, and then questions and answers from our audience. So, Rachel, can I cede the virtual floor to you?
Sure, Mike. So, sorry, sure, Aaron. I'm looking at Marc Ginsberg. So, I think the way to think about the threats that we're facing now is not to get too hung up on the nomenclature. That America faced a series of groups on the far right. Until about 10 or 15 years ago, you could think of 3 main areas of violence arranged into about 3 fairly separable groups, although there was overlap. You had the white supremacists, the KKK that had 3 big surges after the Civil War, in the 20s, in the 50s after Brown versus Board. Then you had a lot more organizationally fluid white supremacist groups. The farm closures in the 80s brought a lot of Midwesterners into the white supremacist movement. They blamed Jewish bankers for the farm closures and their problems. You had a Christian movement within the white supremacy grouping, Christian identity and Aryan nation, appealing to those groups. You had the skinheads in the 80s who appealed to youth, and you had prison groups that got very strong. And the white supremacists, most of their attacks, about 80% of their attacks, were on minorities. Then you had the militias, the anti-government extremists, the pro-Second Amendment groups. That really started after the Vietnam War. A lot of blue-collar folks coming home saying the government sent us to this war, wouldn't let us win, came home pretty angry. And then in the 1990s, gaining a lot of momentum and a lot of steam. I'm sure Mary can talk more about this from her time in the DOJ. But the militias really came up with some organizing strategies, cell strategies, leaderless cell strategies, and so on. The DOJ really snuffed out to a great extent after the Oklahoma City bombing, really pushed back. And then they had this resurgence after 2008 under Obama. And you see this back and forth with these groups where they tend to surge when there's a moment of progress racially, or there's a moment of sort of social change and progress toward a more progressive nation. So no surprise, 2008, Obama becomes president. You suddenly get the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, a whole new series of militias. With the militias, about 80% of the attacks were on federal government, on law enforcement, on politicians, but they weren't so partisan. And I think that's really important to realize. These were anti-government, they were far right, but they weren't as partisan as they are now. And then the last group that had been organized was anti-abortion. These were quite violent, many bombings, much fewer killings than the first 2 groups. Although there were a number of killings, it was much less. And they had some ties to the preservation of the white race. They didn't want abortion against the white race. So these groups blended to some extent, but they were separate. And then finally, I'll say there was state violence. And I don't think in talking about far-right violence, we can avoid the talk of the state violence, from slave patrols in the South as the beginnings of Southern policing, posses in the South that worked in the same way, the willingness of law enforcement to turn a blind eye or work with Klan violence in Mississippi and Louisiana in the 50s and 60s. The FBI had to do a huge amount of work to fight Klan violence in the 60s and 70s in those states. The immense racial animosity in parts of the North and cities in the North that also led law enforcement to have very unequal policing. And that's played a real role because the Oath Keepers militia after 2008, the 3%ers and others have actively recruited from former law enforcement, active law enforcement to some extent, and military, because they're drawing on certain cultures. And so these groups used to be much more separable. I know I only have 5 minutes, so I'll close here and we'll come back to it. But I think the big takeaway is that what's happening now is that in the more modern, last 10 years or so, these groups are continuing. You still have these separate groups, but first of all, they're blending much more. And second of all, they're much more organizing ideas than separate groups. These are things that people can buy into on the web in the same way that you're an Orioles fan and you buy the clothing and you believe in the ideas and you might meet up with other Orioles fans and go to games. You can belong without really being a part of a group in quite the same way. And so the lines are much more fluid and the organizing ideas have become much more fluid. And recruitment has thus become a much more fluid thing as well. And I'll close there.
Thanks, Rachel. That was a fascinating overview. I'm not sure I'll ever think of the Baltimore Orioles the same way anymore. I would only add one thing. These groups appeal to law enforcement and military for, but do they also, and you don't have to answer now, do they also appeal to these groups because of what they believe is their expertise and experience in organization, firearms, explosives, and the like? But Rachel, thanks so much. Mary McCord, let me turn it over to you.
Sure, and that's a great segue, actually, because one of the things that I think that for those who hadn't been focused on this for the last few years, one of the things I think that January 6th really illustrated is that this tent of far-right extremism has gotten very, very big, right? So what we saw on January 6th was a coming together, a coalition, if you will, of conspiracy theorists, including QAnon and others who had been propagating all kinds of conspiracy theories for the last several years, but most recently propagating, with the help of the former president and his surrogates, the notion that the election had been stolen, that President Trump had won in a landslide, and it was through massive election and voter fraud that he was not going to be the president. So that was that core fundamental idea, grievance, if you will, that was able to bring groups together. So you had those conspiracy theorists in the same place as the unlawful private militias, some of which Rachel was just talking about, along with other just out and out, white supremacist, violent extremists who believe in using violence to create essentially a white ethno-state. And then with them, you also had thousands of people who I think probably came to Washington actually legitimately believing that there had been election fraud and seeking to actually, use their First Amendment rights and speak out, probably without any intent to violently overrun the Capitol. But the danger when you have this many groups together in one place like that, egged on by somebody with the veneer of credibility like the president, that's just a recipe for the disaster that we saw. And it just took a few people to start the violence, and so many people followed. The crowd followed, the crowd became a mob, people engaged in violence who probably had no intent to engage in violence. And that is what it was almost like flash radicalization. I mean, some people were already radicalized, but and I hate to coin a new term because it's an awful term, but like other people, I think, did things that were radicalized violence in that moment. So part of the question is, what do we do about it? I've been getting tons of calls since January 6th to talk about domestic terrorism and the gaps in our federal statutes about domestic terrorism, and that's a discussion to have. But I will say there are ample laws that apply to what happened at the Capitol. It was insurrection, it was seditious conspiracy, it was all kinds of other conspiracies, and we're seeing that in the more than 300 cases that have been charged. We have not seen yet insurrection or seditious conspiracy, but those may be coming. We're seeing, initial charges that were easily provable based on the video and matching up video with identifications of people. Get those people off, get those people arrested, immobilize them so they couldn't go on and commit other acts of violence, and then continue to investigate and bring more serious charges when warranted by the evidence. And that's what we're seeing. Initial charges for the violent entry, subsequent charges for conspiracy and things that are more serious. And that was necessary in order to thwart any potential additional attacks that had been planned or additional massive armed rallies that had been planned on the 17th, the 20th, and people are now talking this week about March 4th. So there's plenty of tools to use, but we have to think more broadly than January 6th into how do you combat from a law enforcement and from a whole of government and whole of society perspective, this growth of domestic extremism to the point of radicalization to violence in the US. And that's going to take not only federal and state governmental authorities, but intergovernmental sharing around the world, because this problem is not unique to the United States. It doesn't stop at our boundaries. And we've seen white nationalist extremism growing across, Europe, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, etc. It's going to take, concerted actions by the military, and our new Secretary of Defense has already made commitments to this, and also our police forces, which of course there is no centralized command for police in this country. It's very disparate around the whole country, but they have got to make concerted efforts to, eradicate extremist elements from their ranks. And it's going to take the business sector, and I'm sure Marc will speak to this, technology platforms, but also the business sector writ large, to be more vocal and more adamant about using their tools. And it's going to take political will, because I think we'd be lying to ourselves if we didn't say that one of the reasons that we've seen this explosive growth, for example, of private militias since 2008 is because no one's really countering them. And there are laws on the books, and I'd be happy to talk in much more detail about these later. I'm also trying to be cognizant of the time. Private militias are not authorized in any state under federal or state law. They're not protected by the Second Amendment. Supreme Court's actually been clear about that as far back as 1886, upholding a state anti-militia law that exists to this date on the books of 29 states. The Supreme Court said it was without question states had to be able to prevent private paramilitary organizations. And the Supreme Court under Justice Scalia, one of our most conservative justices, reaffirmed that in 2008. So that's very clear. And all 50 states prohibit them either through their state constitutions, state criminal statutes, or there are other regimes that carefully govern military force and law enforcement. Yet we've seen very, very little enforcement. And you have to ask yourself why that is. And part of it, I think, is political will, because we're talking in many cases about local elected prosecutors, local elected sheriffs and chiefs of police in areas that are very anti-government and very supportive of private militias. Talking about those are the people that would be responsible for actually enforcing law against the very communities that elect them. And that's a gap, and that's a problem that we need to address if we're going to actually have a fulsome, widespread program for countering this type of violent extremism. And I'll stop there.
Mary, that was fascinating. The March 4th date, which I've heard referenced before, that's tied to the inaugural date of presidents.
Historic inaugural date.
FDR and before. That's the idea, to mobilize in Washington, or is this a countrywide?
So it's been talked about in mobilizing in Washington, and there's this notion that Trump will be actually inaugurated as the 19th president, because that would be the next president under that date, and every other president since then has been invalid. Now, right. Washington still remains a fortress around the Capitol, and I think the arrests and prosecutions have had a significant dampening effect on the planning and coordination and mobilization of these conspiracy groups and militia groups. So I actually am not anticipating any sort of massive event, but our law enforcement is definitely preparing for it.
Thank you. Marc, let me turn to you.
Well, thank you. And it's great to be with everybody. Thank you, Aaron. And thanks for the audience for tuning in. So in the few minutes that I have, I want to talk about the role that social media companies are playing in what essentially is militarizing these social movements. We harken back to the days of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, when they in effect perfected the use of social media to incite, recruit, and engage in live stream atrocities as a way of recruiting followers. And what has happened is that these Western groups have seized upon and copycatted ISIS and Al-Qaeda operations with the help of certain governments. And so we have a situation right now in the United States and in Europe where social media platforms have been able to provide that very type of technological support that has enabled these groups to expand their reach, to incite and inspire attacks, as well as to provide financial mechanisms by which they're able to raise funds. And these groups are also facilitated by the support of foreign actors, namely Russia, which is, as well as Germany, where QAnon support is extensive. And so when you add the combination of the Internet Research Agency in Russia, as well as hundreds of thousands of more radicalized QAnon supporters feeding back disinformation and incitement back to their so-called colleagues in the United States. This has become a far more transnational problem. We cannot look at this strictly as if this was a homeland security issue. So much of this is occurring as a result of support, financial support, as well as government support coming from our enemies and adversaries elsewhere. The other problem we face is that we tend to lop social media into what essentially is one platform. But social media is really, we need to understand social media is really being part of a trifecta. You have the major main tech organizations such as Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. And then you have what I would call mobile apps that are used also to facilitate and vector incitement, such as Telegram, Signal, and WhatsApp. And then you have these fringe bulletin boards, which are the real, what essentially the ground zero for many of these extremist operations, such as Gab, 8KUN, 4QNN, areas that more or less begin tipping over into the area of what is known as the dark web. And then you have homegrown web-based extremist groups that operate off of their own web pages, such as the Adam Waffen Division, or Proud Boys, or Boogaloo Boys, or Stormfront, and QAnon. And so when we look at social media, we have to understand how each of these groups are operating off of these various platforms. Is there any effective way to moderate these platforms? Well, everybody goes back to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And the great challenge here is that you have so many people who are in Congress having so many different views of what to do about Section 230. For people out there, who want to understand, Section 230 in effect grants content immunity to social media platforms so that they're not liable for the content that is uploaded on that. Social media platforms spend hundreds of millions of dollars over the last few years trying to protect that immunity and prevent Congress from changing it, from whether it be Trump or President Biden, who have called for the abrogation of Section 230. There's absolutely no consensus within the Congress over what to do about Section 230. And mainstream social media platforms play a whack-a-mole game with Congress. They come up to testify about how much progress they're making, why Section 230 is necessary to them. Congress goes back, considers it, and then they have another hearing 3 months later, and nothing happens after that. And so we have a vicious cycle where Congress itself is trying to introduce new laws, to come up with new ideas involving Section 230, but no one has been able to develop any consensus. And that goes back to the fundamental problem. There's no harmonized system within these social media platforms over what exactly constitute extremist content and incitement. President Trump is removed from Twitter, and yet Rudy Giuliani is still on Twitter. Why is that? He's an insurrectionist in chief. The stuff that he and Trump's son is spreading on Twitter right now is just as bad, in my judgment, as incitement that we've seen on other social media platforms. Facebook, for example, pledged to remove all QAnon content in October, but we're finding QAnon content all over Facebook, and here we are at the beginning of March. Amazon booted Parler off of its web systems, and yet Parler is now back because of the support of other groups that are providing it. And we have, in effect, a transatlantic curtain that has now been created between what I would call the less litigious, less regulated social media platforms here in the United States and the more regulated European Commission and countries in Europe that are regulating these platforms so much more effectively. And there lies the dilemma. Why is Europe doing so much more than the United States? So what can be done? We've proposed several ideas. One is to create a social media standards board similar to the Financial Accounting Services Board that would harmonize and create an independent regulatory body to require these groups to basically adopt a harmonized system as to what constitutes extremist incitement and be held accountable for violating those standards. We also have proposed, because of what happened on January 6th, and it's proven because there's so many great watchdog groups out there, a new social media early warning system center, whereby social media groups like ours that were already warning about the events leading up to January 6th as far back as December 30th, and yet no one was really paying attention to our warnings. There's so many good groups out there that are able to identify extremist content, but we lack, from the federal government on down to the local government, a fusion center that enables those groups to be able to provide early warning system to our local authorities. So I'll stop there. There's so much more to talk about. Thank you very much, Aaron, for my colleagues for letting me join you today.
There is a lot more to talk about on social media, Mark. You know, I suspect the founders who feared demagogues and the people's receptivity to them never anticipated. How could they have anticipated the amplifying effect that social media has? And it actually even gets to Mary's point that the vast majority of those who marched on the Capitol may well have been interested in legitimate protest. But protesting what? A stolen election, with millions of people actually believing this, and to a large degree, not all, to a large degree, social media is clearly responsible for what Rand Corporation called truth decay, although I think it's beyond truth decay now. It's a completely different version of reality. So let me drill down and ask a few questions. You know, Rachel, you provided a terrific overview. Assuming that extremism on the right end, and at least of late, to a lesser degree on the left, has been part of the politics and political culture of America since the 19th century. How is this resurgence? And I would like all of you to weigh in, if you could, from 30,000 feet. How is this resurgence different? Is it more deadly? So are we going to get a tick to the talk in coming years to balance this out? Or have we reached a point, for many different reasons, that this kind of extremism is here to stay?
So I think there's two big things about this most recent uptick. And I think it's worth noting first that we have had this since at least the 19th century, even the Know Nothing Party before and its attacks on immigrants. And so you can go back to the 1840s and 50s. But it comes up, it goes into hibernation and goes down when there's political will to fight it. And so, this is a cancer within our society. This is a thread that runs through us. And I think we need to deal with it at that social and cultural level as well. The amount that we can do solely with the tools of squelching only get us so far, although they're extremely important tools. I think what we're seeing right now is two things. One is that what had been fringe movements have become very mainstream. It's much more easy to buy into a part of them. It's much more easy to say that you're a part of some portion of them without saying you're a full-on white supremacist. You don't have to be so far out of society. And I think the other thing is they have fused with a highly partisan culture. So remember, before I had said you had a far right set of groups, but there was actually gatekeeping by the Republican Party to keep them out. So when David Duke tried to run on the Republican ticket, the mainstream Republicans said, oh my God, no, we're going to run against this guy. When Pat Buchanan tried to run on the Republican ticket, he was pushed out onto his own party. And you saw that again and again when George Wallace had to run on a third party. And so you got real gatekeeping that pushed these people out. What you're seeing now is not only was Trump sending these coded dog whistle signals, and you had dog whistles from Republican leaders, let me be clear about some of this language before, but the actual groups, there'd be dog whistling about racially coded language and so on, but they'd keep the worst of the groups out. Now what you're seeing is this dog whistling plus bringing the groups in. And at the state level, you're seeing much more than dog whistling. I mean, a week after the attack on the Capitol, you saw the head of the GOP in Texas posing with members of militia in full gear and putting it on Twitter. You've seen members in the Oregon State House opening the door to let, in December, before the attack on the Capitol in DC, to let similar types of people into his capital. So just really deep levels of mainstreaming and so on. That is pretty new. And I think what that is pointing to is just how toxic our political culture is right now, how incredibly polarized our political culture has become. And the mainstreaming also has to do with this 50-year history of dog whistling. So we've built ourselves up into a culture in which there's two choices right now. We have a choice of a country that of people who really want to say America is a country that wants to welcome immigrants, that wants to have more progressive views toward women, and so on and so forth. And we have people who, for instance, there was a woman, white suburban mother, anti-abortion activist, evangelical missionary who was with the Take America Back Texas movement, who says, we believe our country is being taken from us, our constitutional rights, our Second Amendment rights, our First Amendment rights are threatened. We're not going to sit back and let it happen anymore. And she was part of this militia movement in Texas. So you get this kind of very mainstream amalgamation of anti-progressive female, anti-government, pro-Second Amendment, all these movements coming together. And what it allows is for groups that were once very much on the fringe to find a place closer to the mainstream. And one way they do that, by the way, is through jokes, through memes. And this is something that we know from psychological studies, that if you say something out and out racist to someone, if you say something out and out sexist, most of us have a rational brain that, for people who want to remain in good standing, says you just can't do that in the 21st century of America. But a joke can get straight through that rational brain and go to a much deeper place, and people pass on jokes. And it's one of the ways that social media is so pernicious, is these jokes and images and memes, these kind of funny things that you wonder about, Pepe the Frog and these kind of weird social media things that you see online. These jokes that get perpetuated allow people to partake in a culture of very light white supremacy, light misogyny, the incel culture that's this male sort of anti-female culture that's becoming more and more violent. And it allows that joking culture to be written off even by people within it, to say, am I part of this? Am I just joking? I don't even really know myself, until they get pulled further and further in, and it becomes more and more mainstreamed. Yeah. And I think what we're seeing is that movement, plus political leaders saying this is okay, and a very partisan situation in our country where if you've picked a side, you want to stay with your team. And so you're buying the clothing and you're out there waving the flag or using the hand signals.
The absence of gatekeeping is, I think, really a very stunning point. You know, in 1925, and the respectability, quote unquote, when the Klan marched on Washington, you see the pictures. Walking down Constitution Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue, I mean, some unhooded, but many in hoods and robes. There was a degree of secrecy and discretion. Now, it's pride, it's identity. And apparently the traditional gatekeepers can no longer do what they need to do. Mary or Mark, a big picture takeaway on why this resurgence may be deadlier and different than in the past?
Let me just add a comment on that, if I can, Mary. Well, Mary, go ahead if you want. Okay. I want to add a dimension to what Rachel just said. You know, Charlottesville 2017 was the Pandora's box that enabled what essentially was a huge letting go of anti-Semitic embracement by many of these groups openly in the United States, courtesy of the President of the United States and his surrogates. And when I think about the accelerationist movements that are now what essentially were the forerunner of many of these white extremist groups, organizations such as the Base, which are trying to accelerate a race war in the United States. And by the way, Oath Keepers and Proud Boys and Boogaloo Boys and the other alphabet soup of extremist groups are not too far behind them. We cannot at any way, shape, or form underestimate the enormity of the role that anti-Semitism is playing in helping to galvanize many of these groups, both here and abroad. and the role of anti-Semitic incitement, whether it be as a result of the anti-immigrant attack that occurred at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, or the attack at the Walmart, which was anti-immigrant in Texas, or the El Paso attack, or the San Bernardino attacks. All of these attacks here in the United States remind us of two things. First of all, this former president is going to continue to provide oxygen to these groups as long as he remains a player in the Republican Party. Number two, the QAnon extremist conspiracy catch-alls who are part of this denying the validity of the election and looking for even more conspiracies which to rally around, have given further rise to political activism that resulted in the election of members of Congress who openly embrace anti-Semitic QAnon and white supremacist beliefs. The fact that the Republican leadership cannot in any way, shape, or form get their hands around and condemn and banish these people is a testament to how far the Republican Party has descended into enabling many of these groups to operate with a certain degree of legitimacy. And let me make one final point. The social media platforms, as much as they express condemnation and reservations and desires to prevent this type of content from being loaded on their content, they only adopt a moral obligation to do so. Until there is a legal duty for these organizations, whether it be the behest of the advertising industry that funds their operations, whether it be because of Congress finally getting its act together on Section 230, whether because the outcry among the American people has reached a crescendo or more regulation, perhaps by the FTC, the social media platforms are as much at fault as enabling this as the political leadership in this country has enabled it to happen leading up to this election.
It's a telling point. I want to return to Google and Apple in a minute. But Mary, a takeaway on your part? The resurgence?
Yeah, you originally asked sort of what's different, and I would say four things, and then I have one other comment. One, Rachel and Mark have both emphasized this. This was embraced by leadership of our country. This gives it a veneer of credibility, and it started with very fine people on both sides, and it's just grown since then. Second, technology. We are now able to spread, those who want to are able to spread propaganda. They're able to merchandise and monetize and recruit in nanoseconds around the world in ways that, in the 1800s, that didn't happen. And even if you just go back, to the 90s and 80s, that didn't happen. And now instantaneously, that is everywhere. Third, we have a growing divide between haves and have-nots of all races and ethnicities. But that means, combined with fourth, the approaching a point of a majority minority in this country leads those, even at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, white people, gives them an excuse to blame people of color and immigrants, et cetera, for their economic problems. And it gives them a coalescing force that allows them to come forward and be parts of these movements. I would push back a little bit on the notion of mainstream, only in one respect. Absolutely right that they're trying to be mainstream, and that one could look out there and think this is looking much more mainstream when you have openly, members of Congress openly embracing conspiracy theories. But many of these organizations, and particularly some of the private militias, they are trying to make it look like something different, right? They will call themselves patriots, and they will say all that they are doing is defending and protecting constitutional rights. They will say we reject racism, we reject white supremacy, we don't allow anyone into our ranks who espouses those views. Now, you don't have to scratch very far below the surface to see the memes, the jokes, etc., that Rachel was talking about, but they're open. Public statements often will be, no, we are about the Constitution. The problem is they have a very different ahistoric, atextual, and against Supreme Court precedent view of what the Constitution says. But that's, I think, their effort to be mainstream by feeling like if we can bring ourselves within these types of labels like patriotism and constitution, then we're mainstream. And that is, they're assisted in that. And this goes to one of the questions in the chat. They're assisted in that by cable news and media who will happily cloak the racism and the white supremacy and the anti-Semitism in constitutional rights.
It reminds me of what Harry Truman said about Richard Nixon. He may have read the Constitution, but he never understood it. This is a telling, fascinating point on the use of the very document that was conceived in an effort to maintain balance and moderation is now being used as a vehicle to defend extremism. It's, well, fascinating, incredibly telling. The New York Times this morning had a story on the front page about the impact of January 6th on these groups. I don't know if any of you saw it, but I want to ask for whoever wants to answer. Maybe, Mary, we could start with you. In your view, it's maybe too early to tell, was January 6th their Lexington and Concord for many of these groups, or did this start a process, particularly with the prosecutions? It's one thing to espouse these views, is another thing to actually serve time. Are these prosecutions, is there any kind of naming and shaming? Will these groups begin to remorph, split up, fracture? Are they going to go to ground? Are they going to become even more dangerous?
So I think we're having, this sounds like a very weird term to use, but we're a little bit in the honeymoon after January 6th, because I think that a lot of the groups are running scared as a result of the prosecutions. I have long said that many of these folks will talk a big game online, but none of them really want to go to prison. And so the fact that people thought that they could come to Washington, D.C. from Ohio and Texas and all over the country, because the prosecutions are now, I think, in almost every single, or people against people from almost every single state, that they could just come and wreak havoc and violently attack the Capitol and then walk away from it is pretty shocking. But that's the mental state they were in. And I think as these, they were euphoric on January 6th, just like the white nationalists were euphoric at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville on the night of the rally. Euphoric, thinking, look what we did. We stepped off of the virtual space into the physical space. We showed our power. We showed our numbers. But then in the days following January 6th, just like in the days following Charlottesville's Unite the Right rally, as the universal rain of condemnation came down upon them and indictments started showing up, you're seeing them start finger pointing, start imploding, start, now some of it is also they've been deplatformed, but there's a lot of now blame shifting, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, one of the national organizations, the 3%ers, has now announced it is dissolving. Now, I think it's going to reemerge with a different name that has to do with being preppers, right? It's rebranding. But the fact that they think it's necessary to do that, I think is pretty telling. So I think we are in this time period right now where they are having to regroup and figure out what their next cause du jour is going to be. And they're in disagreement about that. Some want to stick with the Stop the Steal mantra and, be all in for Trump 2024, et cetera. Some of them think he's going to be reincarnated on Thursday. Others will just fall back on what has always united at least the private militia groups and many of the extremists that align with them, which is guns, right? When all else fails, like earlier this year, we had anti-health measures for the pandemic. We're going to see some more of that. Then we had, racial justice demonstrators who are rioting and looting. Then we had anti-Stop the Steal. But when they don't have any other coalescing issue, they will always fall back on the government's going to take away our guns, and they'll use that to continue.
Rachel, you've written a lot eloquently and persuasively on this whole issue of polarization and tribalization. What do you, and you actually suggested some ways to begin to address this problem. If on the top you have a leadership and a political culture that will, at a minimum, acquiesce and enable, and on the bottom, you have millions of Americans who are genuinely grieving as a consequence of so many factors, which COVID-19 has only, exposed the cleavages and the inequities in our society. How do you begin to address, and I mean, we could spend another 5 sessions on this. Where do you begin? to address the root of these sorts of divisions? George Packer says we've now become two separate, literally two different countries. Neither can be conquered and neither is going anywhere. How do you even begin to deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's a profound question, and I think you see the sorts of conspiracy theories and so on that we're seeing. You see them in low trust countries. I mean, a number of the kinds of countries that the ambassador has served in, and you see them in countries with deep distrust between citizens and government. And so the kinds of problems we're seeing right now go straight to what Mary said. This fear of being replaced, this status anxiety, this loss of a sense of place in the world, and a sense of loss of control over one's life from globalization, from economic changes, not just poverty. People think of it as poverty. There's actually very, very little research suggesting that anything has to do with absolute poverty. It's about where you are in the hierarchy. And particularly if all the other boats are rising and you're not rising as fast, even if you're rising, feeling like, well, what's wrong with me? And how do you displace that onto the other? And if you look at the conspiracy theories, if you look at, say, QAnon, what are the threads pushing people into QAnon? It's the anti-vax movement from the left and the right, some of it pushed by Russia and so on, but some of it just pushed by anxiety about expertise and so on. It's moms worried about pedophiles. It's this heroic men, this idea that we can't be heroic anymore. How do we protect our families? And then the far right politics. So you have this sort of toxic cultural stew, and you say, where do you start? I think the place to really start has to be with leadership, not pushing it up. There's a lot of people who want to start at the bottom, who want to start with one by one we heal our divides. Right. And I emotionally feel that, but all the research says that is actually not very effective. That if you need to make a societal level change in a country of far over 300 million people, you just can't do it one by one. You need to have people at the top, your leaders, and not just political leaders, your pastors, your celebrity spokesman and so on, saying, look, we have to come together. We have to start realizing that we're all coming together at the family dinner tables. We're coming together at Thanksgivings. We are neighbors. We need to find ways to come together. So you need that messaging at the top. Then you need to start healing the nation in very real ways. We can't be this unequal a nation and believe we're going to heal. Structurally, we actually need to bring people together more. We need to deal with some of these things that are having people feel such deep levels of economic anxiety and of status anxiety. That's not just saying whites need to be pulled up again. It's saying, let's deal with the people that feel that our system is rigged against them. They really don't believe that the system is functioning for them, and they see the elites winning all the time. And how do we address that problem in a very real way? And so I think we need to take this not just as an emotional issue, but actually as a practical issue for our country. And it's things like childcare for working women. It's things like getting people back in the workforce, having more equity and all that, helping people feel like they have a place in our society. And then we can start the one-on-one healing. But in a nation of 300 million, we need it on a big level. It needs to scale.
Yeah, it's going to take time and it's generational. Marc, building on Rachel's point about political leadership, the Coalition for a Safer Web, which is your organization, is suing both Google and Apple. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And one other question, what is the problem? Well, I think I know the answer, but what is the problem with Congress?
Okay.
And
well,
30, is it campaign contributions from big tech? Is it the same kind of polarization that affects legislation on almost every other issue? Lawsuits in Congress.
Sure. The lawsuits that we brought were unprecedented against Google and Apple, largely because one of the major vectors of extremist incitement and operations in the United States is through the mobile app Telegram. Now, Telegram is a transnational mobile application, which is used largely for good purposes, to support democracy movements in Iran and Russia and Belarus. But it's also become the weapon of choice, the social media weapon of choice for extremist operations. It's almost a one-stop supermarket that's enabled these organizations to operate in and out of the United States, raise money, organize, recruit, etc. And the lawsuits we brought were against Apple and Google for enabling Telegram to operate on their mobile platforms is the only way to exercise or to compel them to exercise their financial ability to leverage against Telegram to force content moderation. Now, Telegram could clean up if its act if it wanted to, but it's doing everything it can to transnationally avoid any national regulatory authority. Now, with respect to Congress, Congress is going to have another 5 hearings in the next few weeks on the role of privacy and the role of social media in extremism. So once again, you'll see Zuckerberg and Pichai from Google and whoever comes up from Twitter, maybe it's Mr. Orsi, to testify before Congress. And once again, Congress will go through their gyrations of wondering why these groups are not doing more. Look, the fact of the matter is that until Congress decides to add more restrictions on the right of these organizations to operate with impunity, these organizations will not believe they have anything but a moral obligation to constrict extremist incitement on their platforms. They feel like they're doing a favor to us by engaging in content moderation. And all of those who have their hair on fire, oh, this is a violation of First Amendment, the ACLU goes crazy. The fact of the matter is that these social media platforms, as I said, spend millions of dollars lobbying members of Congress, raising money for them in order to prevent regulation. Well, this is where the dilemma lies. What exactly is regulation supposed to accomplish? Section 230 was amended several times to prohibit child pornography and sex trafficking. Why can't it be amended to prohibit the incitement of extremist operations on social media platforms? Why on YouTube, for example, Aaron, can I go on and download thousands of instructional videos on how to make a pipe bomb? Okay, what public interest is served by that? That very activity was used by the student at Parkland High School to build his pipe bomb. Well, you're going to YouTube, which, by the way, hides behind the apron strings of its parent Google, has never really been held adequately accountable for why, for example, instructional terrorist incitement videos are permitted on its platform, let alone its anti-Semitic content on its platform. I'm using them as an example of what is so wrong with social media.
I'm just thinking about January 6th, the People's Temple. I mean, what if that didn't bring it home to representatives and senators in this Congress? Whatever will.
I ask myself, why hasn't Speaker Pelosi fulfilled her commitment that she pledged to do to prevent social media platforms from being able to expand their 230 rights? Look what happened just a few months ago. The social media platforms were able to convince the previous administration to extend Section 230 immunity on trade agreements. Why? Mm-hmm. Why would they do that? As a way of making it even more difficult for Congress to revoke Section 230 immunities on extremist operations.
Okay, we're nearing the end of the hour. I have a question here. It's a hard one. It gets to the issue that Rich was discussing. Ben Olarsh asks a question I'm interested in. Could civic education be a long-term solution to the problem of combating extremism? I mean, what role do curricula and teachers play in all this? Or do they reflect to some degree the communities and the views of the parents? Any thoughts?
I know there's a big push. It was in the front page of the Washington Post today on civic education. And certainly our country could use more civic education. Just we could learn more about our history. We could know more about Reconstruction and so on. But as a cure for this, I'm pretty skeptical. I have to be fair. First of all, there is a large portion of our country that really wants to believe that America is a Christian nation with a mission sent by God to spread our good to the world. They don't want to necessarily hear bad things about the country. There's an AEI survey, and there's a lot of survey evidence from the evangelical community about that belief set being fairly deep set. So if you try to have a civics education that talks about things like the Reconstruction era issues of problems in our history, you're just going to fall into all the culture wars that we have been in for the last number of decades. And it might even expand some of the problems that we're facing right now. So I worry about what would the content be. I think all of us had the experience of going through schooling in different places where, you know, in Massachusetts, you learn about the American Revolution every single year from kindergarten through the 12th grade. And in Alaska, where I'm from, you learn about Alaska history. It's not particularly helpful from a what is democracy. And if what you learn about is I'm a bill on Capitol Hill, that, you know, maybe tells you more about how you get something done, but it doesn't necessarily give you trust in the system when people have such deep trust. So I think that it's always good to know about our history. It's a complicated history, but I'm not sure that it's going to solve this problem. People have strong, what's called motivated cognition. They seek out information that confirms the beliefs they already have. And if you look at the people who rioted on January 6th, it's an older group of people. These are people pretty far from their schooling years. And so, you know, whether they remember what they learned in middle school from 25, 30 years ago is dubious to me.
Yeah. Mary, can I ask you a question about First Amendment, the whole First Amendment issue? I was stunned. General Secretary of Defense Austin, as you know, recently issued what they call a military-wide stand-down order. Sometime before April 1st, I believe, the military has been instructed to participate either in a day or to devote some measure of time to discussing this issue of extremism. But what stunned me was, and I may be wrong here, and so if anyone, please let me know, current rules apparently governing these issues permit active duty troops to join organizations so long as they don't become quote unquote active members who fundraise, recruit, or take part in other prohibitive activities. Now, I don't know whether that is accurate or not, but on the issue of First Amendment, how do you parse this out? I mean, what should be not prohibited or prohibited? I mean, you have law enforcement and ex-military involved in this, which strikes me as a very serious and potentially deadly problem based on their levels of expertise.
So, you know, I think there can be a lot of confusion when we talk about First Amendment rights, whether we're talking about the rights of military members, the rights of people on social media, and what the government can do. And the fact is, you're not entitled to be a member of the media. I mean, of the military. You're not, you know, you don't get to just say automatically, I want to be in the military and get to be in the military. So there is leeway there for the military to have guidance and requirements and to prevent extremist views because they are a threat to the military and they're a threat to national security. Now, when we talk about First Amendment in terms of government making different requirements under, for example, the Community Decency Act, as Mark was talking about, which is a different aspect from the military entirely, then again, this talk about First Amendment rights comes up because even though the platforms can do absolutely anything they want, they're private businesses, they're not bound by the First Amendment. Once the government tells them what to do, then the First Amendment is triggered. And so that's been another one of these shields put up to sort of say, don't touch this because this is taboo and you'll violate First Amendment rights. And this is part of the level setting that I think needs to take place. To go to the education point, I think we need to be educating grownups more so than children. Because if children are hearing something different at home than what they're hearing in school, they're going to go with what they hear at home in most cases. And it's the grownups who have got a screwed up view of the First and Second Amendments. First Amendment doesn't protect incitement to imminent lawless activity or violence or threats of violence. Now, we may need to have some litigation to modernize our view of what it means to be imminent lawless activity in light of the ubiquity of social media and the fact that things can be spread in nanoseconds. The Supreme Court's never had to grapple with that. And I think imminence has a very different meaning now with social media than it did at the time the case Brandenburg was decided that established that test. The second thing they need to level set is on the Second Amendment. I cannot tell you how many people, including people in law enforcement around the country, firmly believe that the Second Amendment gives people a right to form their own private armed militias, both to oppose what they'll call the tyranny of the government and to augment the government in like doing their own law enforcement. And neither of this is true. And if I can make 3 quick points before we leave, and I alluded to this earlier, but didn't complete the thought. No authority under our Constitution federally or under state constitutions for private militias. Well-regulated has always meant regulated by the governor. The governor didn't want rogue militias challenging authority. It's what it's always meant. Second Amendment, as I stated earlier, doesn't protect private paramilitaries. It protects an individual right to bear arms for self-defense, not collective self-defense by private, unregulated, unauthorized groups of people. And third, every state does prohibit this through their constitutions or their state laws. So if there's one thing we could level set in this country right now that I think would actually really help with public safety, it's that this is not Second Amendment protected. And much of what we're hearing on the internet is not First Amendment protected. So let's educate grown-ups.
Excellent point. I want to thank the 3 of you. This has been one of the most depressing conversations I think we've had, given the challenges that we face, but it's also been one of the truly richest, and your authority and expertise is really impressive. So Mary, thank you, Rachel, and Ambassador Ginsberg. And thanks to our viewers for tuning in until the next Carnegie Connects. Take care.